Hi, this is Adam Carroll from Justice for All. This show is UN This Week, and we'll be talking about authoritarian governments and hate speech in Asia today with our guest from Asia Center. But first, wanted to give an intro about the 75th anniversary of the UN. UN Day was this weekend, and a number of events are taking place. They are putting the arts out as a vehicle. Perhaps we can have that image to show the relevance of the anniversary. Perhaps we can have the next image, and there's a number of events going on that are recognizing the role of the arts in promoting the ideals of the United Nations. And here these cities are images of various cities, including Bangkok, where today's guest's organization is located, I believe. And is this correct, Robin?
We are in the heart of Bangkok.
Yes. Well, welcome to the show, Robin Ramcharan. He's the executive director of Asia Center, which is a think tank and non-for-profit organization that seeks to create social impact in Asia. It's a meeting space, project partner, and social enterprise, first established in 2015, and also with a branch in Malaysia. And Robin, your background is really interesting. You've been all around, basically. You're a professional professor of international relations, but you've been involved not only in academia, but the private sector, and very much besides human rights in development projects. So I guess I wanted to ask you a first question about the relationship or the possible relationship of development and human rights. Does this come up in your work? And in general, how do people treat these? Are they totally separate silos?
Well, first of all, I think to answer your question very specifically, I think for a long time, the development professionals and academics, they didn't have a conversation with the human rights people. But I would say in the last 20, 25 years or so, that conversation is being had more and more. The relationship between the two is much more discussed and debated. Secondly, I think the human rights community has been advancing since the early 70s, this idea of the right to development, and arguing that it's inherent to the whole human rights project. Without development, how can you have freedom? This is Amartya Sen, going back to Amartya Sen's book, for example. So there is a very serious conversation today. And in my own work, I used to work in the World Intellectual Property Organization. And, I think we are all aware of the advent when the WTO was formally created in 94. The members adopted something called the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. So developing countries at that time started to try to catch up. And one of the dimensions to all of this that was added, especially in the context of the WIPO, was development. There was a development agenda, which basically says developing countries need to have some leeway. We cannot do everything all at once. First of all, what is this intellectual property? Is it good for us? And how shall we implement it? Now, I mentioned that because to bring it back to human rights and development specifically, human rights also became a big topic in the cooperation for development sector of the WIPO. What are the human rights dimensions of patenting or trademark law or and so on? What are the rights of indigenous peoples and how do they relate to this tool of innovation, which is great for development, but at the same time, how do you protect indigenous people's rights in that context? So I would say across the board, there is a more serious conversation between human rights professionals and development professionals.
I'm glad it's not simply conflict, that there's actually conversation. It reminds me, since we're all in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, um, that your center is hosting various discussions on COVID-19, including one I think that's coming up on COVID, on, is it vaccine nationalism? Is that the right term?
Yes, yes, correct. In January, we have an annual event called the Benedict Anderson Memorial Seminar. And for those who may not know Benedict Anderson, he was a famous anthropologist who passed away a few years back. And Benedict invited the whole world through his book Imagined Communities to consider nationalism beyond Europe, beyond the confines of, let's say, a small group of people in the UK who were writing about nationalism. So he said, he examined Indonesia, Thailand, and so on. And so we have been honoring him, the late Benedict Anderson, by having these seminars. So gender and nationalism, for example, was the last one. Next year, it's about COVID-19 or vaccine and nationalism. It's very interesting, going back to the human rights dimension. We all have this right to health, access to medicines, and that's one of the big discussions that has been taking place in the WIPO and the WHO. Is this idea of this right to health and right to access to medicine as part of that. So there's a global norm, but what we see beginning to happen, and I think this has happened in the past, but in relation to this crisis, what we see is countries becoming a bit protective. Well, if I develop it first, I want my people to get it first, that kind of attitude. Some countries have even tried to acquire it, let's say, quietly, for their own populations, buying off stocks, for example. At least that idea has been mooted in the press. So it's very interesting. During the last SARS crisis, the previous SARS crisis, Indonesia, I believe, for example, was involved in the search for solutions. And as they engaged in research, I have read some articles, and so your audience and colleagues can look this up. But in the course of teaching on this, I came across academic works which pointed to the fact that it's not only Indonesia, but this kind of nationalism was present. And so Indonesia was reluctant to share some of its research data because they feared that others will take it and claim the benefit, claim victory, if you will. And that is very much going on now between countries.
That's a shame. I think the United States is also doing the same thing right now with the vaccine, buying up stocks at least. But it's interesting that this kind of nationalism has come up before, and I wonder what the alternative is, really. I mean, what role could the UN or the international community play in ensuring a more level playing field?
Oh, I think that we already have a mechanism, however imperfect it is. And for the most part, my impression, I'm not an expert on the WHO, the World Health Organization, but we do have a multilateral system, a process. Of course, it's highly imperfect. The UN is only as good as its member states will allow it to be. And so we need to improve the WHO, make its processes, standards better. If you have countries holding back information which they are supposed to provide on crises, as part of their agreement with the rest of the countries through the WHO, if you're withholding, that's not a failure of the architecture. That's a failure of the individual responsibility of the particular country. So I think we do have systems which need to be improved, but unfortunately, what I see is a serious lack of political will to get that done. This coming back to nationalism, a kind of archaic nationalism is still present, and I think we have to go beyond that because. If you will allow me, it is somewhat irrational in today's world to think that you can solve these problems on your own. It's just not credible. So you need to improve the systems. My colleagues in Geneva, working in various organizations, especially the Swiss have promoted, for example, the idea of multi-stakeholder networks across organizations. This is an old idea, but maybe taking root and being implemented so that these organizations themselves are not stuck in their own silos, and so on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that reminds me also that you guys are based in Bangkok, and we hear in the news that there are protests, quite passionate protests going on. And this is coming on the heels of COVID-19, which I think for a long time barely touched Thailand. It was amazing. We were all looking to you for your secret, but I think that is beginning to change. And of course, there's also, besides that pressure, the threat of infection, there's outrage at the government. Is there one cause for this outrage? Is it archaic nationalism that is arising, or that people are against? What is really going on, do you think?
Well, I think in Thailand there are a number of things. So with regard to the COVID situation, many people followed the guidelines. They understood why you needed to have a emergency, not decree, but emergency law for health reasons. They understood why your basic rights in that context had to be limited. And by and large, just anecdotally walking around living in Bangkok, you could see that people took personal responsibility, and they had a sense of community, and they would follow, the wearing of the masks and so on, social distancing. So that's one thing. At the same time, people were conscious as the crisis progressed that there was a perception and maybe strong feeling more than perception that the authorities were taking advantage of the crisis in order to extend the decree, not the decree, sorry, the national emergency. And so that's been extended quite a few times. One of the additional concerns is, okay, we cannot, certain rights are restricted, such as right to free assembly, large gatherings, and so on. But why should you limit my right to criticism of your handling of this pandemic? And so the COVID-19 laws in Thailand and across the region, you could look at Cambodia, Myanmar, and so on, they provide for allow governments to attack critics, under the guise of fake news about COVID. So I understand where that's coming from. Partly, of course, you don't want a lot of conspiracy theories to be floating around because they can be very harmful. And I think you in the United States are dealing with this issue. So I understand that, but at the same time, the problem is that critics, genuine critics, have been detained. Even those who have reposted critiques have also been gone after. So that's the second thing, the overstepping the limits. Of course, all of this is happening on top of the problematic elections that took place in 2019, because for many reasons it was very problematic. The current leader mounted a coup in 2014, May of 2014, as they secured the monarchical succession and so on. They basically drafted, quote unquote, drafted a new constitution, which basically brought in a system which allows for multiple parties to, I'm trying to simplify it, multiple parties to emerge. And so the party that was affiliated with the coup leader, General Prayut, that party got the plurality, and they also, I have to be careful with my words, but they also made sure that other parties joined them. And the one party which the young people of this country identified with strongly is called the Future Forward Party. And unfortunately, for the government, they won about 16 to 17% within the space of 1 year, which is phenomenal for a new party created 1 year before. And what was their platform? Reform of monarchy, reform of civil military relations, among other things, and offering a very progressive, maybe perhaps social democratic vision for Thailand. And of course, as we know, that the army and the monarchy and so on have had a very close relationship. And so conservative forces have seen this as a threat. Young people, just when COVID hit, just before, young people started to protest again. I teach here in Bangkok. I've been doing this for the last 10 years or so. And at places like Thammasat University, which is the home of the democracy movement almost in Thailand, the students were reluctant to engage. But now you see that their reticence has gone, and they started protests around February, March of this year. You could say, luckily for the government, the COVID hit, and so large public gatherings were stopped. In the meantime, the Future Forward Party was disbanded. And this was widely seen as a bit of a joke. The Constitutional Court in Thailand has tended to side with the current governments and previous such governments, which have tended to overthrow democratically elected leaders. So it's in that context that these protests are happening. So they're not so much about COVID, but the abuses of the COVID law, the additional decrees, the attempt of the conservative forces to stymie the demands of largely, not only, but largely young people who are, I think, protesting because they could not see a clear future in Thailand. Yeah.
You know, this week I was reading a new letter signed by 49 world leaders, many of them retired world leaders like Mary Robinson, but still active, and Madeleine Albright and so forth, asking the UN to reform itself, basically, and saying that the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity not to go back to business as usual, but to really think of a better future for us all. That brings us together. But that said, I mean, these students are way ahead of this letter. and I think that they see things a little bit more well, with more bluntness and honesty, perhaps. But I think we need these different tracks of these different conversations going on, because I think that many interests do want to go back to the exact same inequalities, the exact same racisms. Your description of the mix of COVID-19 pandemic and protests sounds, well, it resonates here in the United States. And yet, we don't know where it's going, and you don't know where it's going. So it's a very
Yeah.
interesting time. It's interesting that you teach, and you're in the middle of the university life, and you see how these concerns are reflected. So you had said that you think that students are beginning to adapt this struggle as their own. Do you think there'll be a long-term commitment?
Well, one of the big questions at the moment is, the students have achieved some measure of success, building on the platform, although disbanded, the platform of the Future Forward Party, which offered a very progressive vision for Thailand. So they're trying to capitalize and build on that, not simply as a raw political move, but rather out of genuine sentiment. They are genuinely worried about the future. Now, they have been successful insofar as they've created space for that. And for the first time in Thailand's history, you have open criticism despite very harsh laws, Section 112. You have open criticism of the monarchy, which is seen as totally, and by many, as a kind of an archaic institution. And so will it succeed? Well, they've succeeded in that sense. Now, will the government, the current government, and the powers that be, the conservative forces, will they allow them to go any further? And so it reminds me of the year-long protests in Chile, where they have finally achieved what they were asking for, which is the redrafting of the constitution. Well, that's what they're asking for here, is a properly drafted, legitimate new constitution in which you have a return to a constitutional monarchy and so on. Will they achieve that? Remains to be seen, because the great difficulty in Thailand remains the army in particular, not the entire armed forces, but the army. The army chiefs closely allied with the powers, the head of state, they see themselves as the protector of the monarchy, religion, nation, those three things. And so Thailand, unfortunately, I think my feeling is that it's headed for rough times.
I'm sorry. In Burma, we see the army dug in to the government, in control of certain ministries. The Constitution controls and protects the army's power, and reform is very difficult. Even the political will of the NLD party, the civilians, to reform is very weak, it appears, and they're heading into an election in November. I guess authoritarianism comes in many flavors, but it's very common in Asia. I mean, you have Duterte in his brand of authoritarianism in Philippines. You've got a whole range of authoritarians, some of whom are sitting pretty and feeling comfortable, and others maybe not so much. So as far as hate speech and disinformation, because I think that you recently had an event which we'll talk about that focuses on these things. Do the authoritarian governments of Asia, from India to China, to Malaysia and beyond, do they promote disinformation actively?
Well, this is one of the interesting questions that we have been discussing, debating, and raising. Is, of course, there are all forms of fake news, disinformation coming from multiple sources, but one of the key sources is governments themselves. So this came up very much in our various activities, events regarding hate speech. Um, uh,
Maybe if you
in
could just
some,
say what kind of conference it was and when it happened.
Sure, sure. So we held recently an international conference on hate speech in Bangkok from 7 to 9 October. This conference is part of a series of events on a project that we call Freedom of Expression Project. Last year, we had a conference on fake news, and of course, fake news and hate speech are intimately related. And so this year, we had a series of events on hate speech. Earlier this year, we launched a report, a study on hate speech, new forms, old rules, right? Arguing for the need to have new definition of hate speech to accommodate new forms. And that very much featured in this conference as well. So we could get into a kind of the key points of the conference, but one of the points that was raised in different panels over the 3 days was government hate speech itself. Government hate speech against, for example, political opponents. Differences over political ideology is one of the new forms of hate speech that has very much surfaced here, and I think elsewhere in the world. Differences over political ideology, demonization of the other. And so governments are also guilty of this, and it's not very new. Authoritarian governments especially have been guilty of this for a long time. Oh, you are basically critiquing us, and you are going against national security, that kind of a mentality. So this is almost old news, but still present very much today. The ASEAN countries, as they have been genuinely and rightly thinking about how to address fake news, they adopted a declaration a couple of years ago in which they said they have to take actions to fight this. But of course, the big question is um, who defines what is hate speech? And basically, they're saying we will define. Singapore has adopted a law, the POFMA, POFMA, to combat hate speech. And it allows ministers to combat fake news, sorry, and including hate speech. It allows ministers to be the ultimate arbiters of what is fake and what isn't. And so they will label so and so as whatever, deviant, et cetera, et cetera. And so government hate speech is something that we have to watch that has emerged. And of course, whether it's the fake news laws or these attempts to combat hate speech, which is necessary, um, we do have to hold them to account in the current environment. There is undoubtedly, there has been a regression in democracy and rights and the rule of law in this region. And in addition to the older laws that were there previously, Internal Security Act, cyber laws, blasphemy laws, well, you suddenly have fake news laws, hate speech, anti-hate speech measures, which put together, basically, it's a new layer to stymieing, suppressing freedom of expression.
It's yeah, it sounds very concerning. I was reading the website, and I understand that it was quite an extensive conference. I was able to attend one part of it virtually, but you also had some in-person, socially distanced meetings.
Yeah.
47 speakers, about half female. You know, you had some good uh, uh, facts and figures. It sounds like quite a useful conference. We can speak a bit about what may come out of the conference right after we have a break for station identification. This is Adam Carroll with Justice for All, and this is UN This Week. And we're back from an extensive vacation, and here we are at UN This Week with Robin Ramcharam, the Executive Director of Asia Center, a very active think tank based in both Bangkok and in Malaysia.
Yes, in Johor Bahru, Malaysia.
Yeah. So do you find you all are fairly free to operate in both of those locations, or is it tricky? Do you get in trouble?
Oh, of course, like everywhere, you have to be mindful of the sensitivities and know how to navigate those sensitivities. We do a policy-oriented work. We are a think tank that's oriented towards policy and making a social impact. We are not, for example, a hard frontline organization such as Amnesty or others. But at the same time, we try to work constructively to address problems. For example, we work with parliamentarians. We've been doing some studies on some research on, for example, freedom of religion or belief in Southeast Asia. And we've collaborated with the International Panel of Parliamentarians on Freedom of Religion or Belief to do country studies with practical suggestions as to how to address this problem in each country. So that's the kind of work we have been working with. One of the great demands in the region and maybe the world is for evidence-based research that will inform advocacy and policy making. And so we are very much in that stream. That's where we think we can contribute effectively. We, of course, produce policy documents, and one policy-oriented document is precisely the report on hate speech. Ideas do matter, and some would say they run the world. So we hope to have that kind of impact, both in terms of ideas and operationally.
We've posted some links to the recent conference, and also to the YouTube channel that has a number of really interesting conversations, an exchange of ideas that we hope will run the world if they're honest and constructive. I know that you also have done a report on the Rohingya, and keep an eye out on that issue.
Yes.
And I don't know if you also work in either India or China. Those are huge countries with many issues, human rights concerns. And I was wondering if your center gets involved with any of those.
Well, as you said, we have been engaged with regard to the plight of the Rohingya people, which is really one of humanity's worst tragedies. It's really, I don't know what the word is, other than this pathetic word of it's just terrible, surprising that the world has not been able to do anything, hasn't lived up to its own ideals, right? Responsibility to protect. So we have been engaged. We have been doing some work, for example, on the health of the Rohingya people, refugees in places like Malaysia. So we did a study on their health situation, for example. I was in Dhaka a few years back at a meeting where the Bangladeshi government was really grappling with this, how to handle this situation. And that is still an ongoing conversation. Of course, we know in Rakhine the basically civil war that's going on, and the great question is, how do you resolve all of this in a way that makes the Rohingya people and other people in the state in the area feel safe and welcome? And it's one imagines that a key to this answer is some form of federalism, of the decentralized federalism. And so Rakhine State, how it seems to me that how the authorities and the international community together handle a resolution of the Rakhine State issue is very key to Burma's own future. And
Yeah.
it is an extreme example of the same dynamics, but to lesser degrees of severity, in other parts of Southeast Asia. Take Thailand. How do you handle the problems in the South, for example? Where, by the way, sorry to cut you off, where, by the way, problems of hate speech are also present. Research by local Bangkok-based researchers on hate speech in the South have shown a spike, especially during the COVID times. Online, actually, a lot of online hate vis-a-vis the southern insurgency, of course, with the majority Muslim population.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of Islamophobia, but xenophobia in general on social media, and it's hard to know to what extent this is run by bots. But there seem to be a lot of real people that are stirred up and quite angry here in the United States as well. The hate speech, in Malaysia against the Rohingya who have found safe haven there as refugees, or quote unquote refugees. They're not recognized, but they, until recently, those Rohingya felt relatively included in Malaysian society, but now that has changed, and I know some Rohingya leaders who are really very frightened and have been their what's the word? Their home address has been published. People send them hate mail and death threats and threaten their children. The whole thing. So doxing, I think it's called. So there's these really ugly mob mentality kind of movements going on. And of course, as we were talking about earlier, some of it is manipulated by governments. So this whole trend that we're talking about, what is something that we can do about it? I don't want you to give away all the secrets of your upcoming report, but some, whether it's media literacy, whether it's controls on incitement, what sort of ideas?
Well, let me start off with this one. An important point that was made both last year in last year's fake news conference, conference about fake news, and this year's this year's hate speech conference is law is necessary, but law is not the only answer, and maybe not the main answer. You need a range of policies across a number of areas. Language, government institutions, integration, religious practices, and so on. You need policies. You actually probably need some kind of national policy, whether it's on fake news or fake news and hate speech and so on. A national policy framework with guidelines and maybe even soft rules, if I might put it that way, soft guidelines that people can follow and practice. One of the great difficulties, of course, is exactly defining hate speech. And one of the interesting points coming out of this conference is that, well, hate speech doesn't have the same connotation or meaning that it may have in Western countries, where there is an emphasis on the norm of freedom of expression, and short of violence, anything is allowed. So here and other places, they tend to see it differently. There are other forms. For example, interestingly, there is intergenerational hate speech, which emerged.
Hmm.
The youth attacking the older people and the older people attacking the youth
Hmm.
here in Thailand, and using specific terms, which
Hmm.
it's very difficult for the researchers who were talking about this to even say the terms from fear of offending people. So a law is not the answer, only answer. It's very important. Related to that, I think policies in particular and the laws have to address the sources of the problem. And so discussions of hate speech tended in the past, rightly so, tended to focus on race, religion, gender, and so on. But the newer forms, going back to what you were just saying, in your question, the newer forms include hate speech against migrant workers,
Hmm.
against migrants in general, refugees, minorities. Secondly, against different political ideologies. Um, uh, and sorry, I'm just the last one, but there are three new forms. Um, yes, against sexual minorities.
Hmm.
So these three forms have to be accommodated in some kind of new definition.
Hmm.
And so national policy can set the tone, national guidelines eventually leading to some kind of law. So you have to address it at the source. And interestingly, in addition to those, among the sources of these problems that were mentioned is problems of inequality and poverty in this globalized world. People have been left out, and they then join these populist movements. I think that's a all too familiar story in the United States.
Hmm.
So that's also present here. So you have to address the problem at the source. So in giving you my answer, I'm thinking of the possible solutions. Yes, law is necessary, but you also have to look at the roots. You have to, number three, while upholding freedom of expression, yes, but you have to, we come back to the old dilemma. Is it acceptable to hurt feelings? And what's the threshold? Is it acceptable to hurt feelings? Fine. But if you move towards violence, then that's the threshold. That's the line in the sand. Well, the question is, where is the line in the sand in different contexts?
Hmm.
And that's something. But a key point in all of this is that you have to uphold, there are international standards, right? There is something called the rule of law. It's, of course, not the rule of any law. And the rule of law basically says in, in instituting limitations of rights, you must make sure that it's legitimate, necessary, and proportional. And that's
Hmm.
the international standard. That came up in the discussion.
Hmm.
The last, at least for now, last two things I will mention. There are more,
Hmm.
but the last two things are, one is you need a more responsible media. Whether it's
Hmm.
mainstream or new media, you need truth-seeking media,
Hmm.
and that's sorely lacking. There are some who are trying, but the business imperative, unfortunately, tends to dominate. And so, truth-seeking media, and not merely an agenda-driven media, agitators.
Hmm.
In that regard, I find it encouraging that the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, has called for a parliamentary commission to review the influence and monopoly of a certain person over all of Australia's media.
Ah. Ah.
So
Right.
let's see where that goes, because he has been a force that has not been quite not been very good. Uh,
No, no. I remember when I was really young, the New York Post, which is owned by this individual, or at least was for many years, anyway, it used to be a liberal paper,
Yeah.
and it's been such the opposite. Well, anyway, we are running out of time, and it's been really great to chat about these ideas, and there are more ideas I know coming, but I think that part of the answer certainly is more public discussion,
Could
consensus
I?
building. Yes,
Sorry, Adam. Let me just throw in one last point. It's a very
sure.
important point, and
Yes.
I think it's the role of the tech companies,
Ah,
the
yes.
large tech companies. They have been really, they have woken up, but it's been somewhat late. And so they have to do their part in upholding their own standards, which they
Hmm.
haven't been doing. They have started to collaborate with governments, and in the case of Indonesia, flagging the government body will flag the so-called fake content, hate speech content, and ask Facebook to do something about it. So I think they really have to wake up and do their part. Uh,
Hmm.
the Rohingya people know all too well the consequences.
Exactly. Well, we could talk about technology and development and human rights. There are many